Section 15.6, Forced Oscillations and Resonance. This is where things kind of blow up, or they can, for better and for worse. So forced or driven oscillations are subject to a periodic applied force. So an example of this could be like if you're on the swing set and there's someone who's pushing you, they're periodically applying a driving force to push you along on the swing. So the forced oscillator is going to oscillate at the angular frequency of its driving force. So we see almost the same equation, x of t is equal to xm cosine omega d times t plus phi. The only difference is that it's the driving frequency here of what's going to result in the displacement. So the actual displacement amplitude is a complicated function that depends on the natural frequency, omega, of the oscillating system and the driving frequency, omega d, right? So you could imagine with, say, your spring, if you push it, right, there's a natural frequency at which it wants to go up and down, but you could just kind of push it at random times or very periodic, but not at its natural frequency. And then it gets kind of this crazy motion in there. Similarly, if you have a friend on a swing set and you don't push them at the highest point in the swing, but you push them at some intermediate point or at a slightly different frequency, then their motion is going to be very inconsistent. But you get the velocity amplitude is greatest when you can match that driving frequency to the natural frequency of your oscillator. So that gives you the largest velocity, and this condition is known as resonance. This is also approximately when the displacement amplitude is the largest. So that's what's shown here in the graph. For different values of damping, right? If you have the least amount of damping, you see this most pronounced, but it's at the same point that if you look at the driving frequency relative to the natural frequency, when they're exactly equal, the amplitude of the motion gets huge compared to on either side, the amplitude is much smaller. So we'll see if this loads quickly, but there's a PhET simulation that takes a look at resonance, right, with masses and springs, and you can adjust it to see when you can get that fast moving oscillation. So here we have our mass on the end of the spring, right? And it has a frequency it wants to oscillate at just if it's able to bounce freely and do its thing, if we set it in motion. There's some damping, so it's naturally slowing down, right? But there's also a driver on here that we could turn on that will make it jiggle up and down and oscillate it, right? So keeping in mind sort of its natural up and down of about how fast that is, I'm gonna go ahead and slow that down, speed up the slowdown. Okay, and I'm gonna turn on the driver and we'll see how it compares. Notice now the driver is pushing it up and down, and it is going up and down. And that's pretty good, right? It's overcoming the damping, so we have a larger amplitude of the motion. We could similarly turn down the frequency, and now look, it isn't oscillating nearly as much. It's not that the amplitude of the driver has changed, but now sometimes the driver is going up when the mass is trying to come down, and it's like it's not really working together very well. We can turn it back up a little. Yeah, still not seeing much. Let's try going back to 1 hertz. This is definitely hopping. Keep going a little more. And notice once we get above it, it slows down, right? The displacement's kind of jiggly where sometimes it's going up and sometimes it's not. So the resonant frequency is when the driver is exactly matched to the natural frequency, and that's where it's really going fastest and doing the best, which appears to be pretty close to 1 hertz. We get the largest amplitude there. So this helps to highlight the ideas. Now, why do we care about resonance? Well, for one, it has important implications for the stability of structures. If you have forced oscillations at the resonant frequency, you could have rupture or collapse, which is amazing. I mean, it's not something you want to be the designer of, but to get to see it is pretty cool. Something that's often brought up when we talk about resonance, and it's not quite the same, but it's important to highlight, is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. So let's take a listen to this video. It's a pretty short one.
Tacoma Bridge, Washington, opened only a few months ago, was built at a cost of over $6 million. But misfortune overtakes the great structure. These are some of the most amazing pictures ever recorded by a newsreel. The actual collapse of the world's 3rd largest suspension bridge. Only a 35-mile-an-hour wind is blowing, but this apparently sets up a rhythmic swinging of the bridge, which increases with each swing. Finally, the swinging road and the suspension cables give way and plunge into the water below. Fortunately, the only casualties were a car stalled on the bridge and a dog.
So that's amazing to see, right? You can design this bridge, but they didn't account for how the wind would interact with it. And this is a case less of resonance and more of something known as flutter, aerodynamic flutter, of how it's catching the wind, but creating this rhythmic motion that caused it to break, which is pretty wild. One example of resonance that was less dramatic in its epic breaking, but is resonance, is another bridge in London, the Millennium Bridge. This is a pedestrian footbridge. So for this one, we don't need the audio. But you can see there are people walking on the bridge. And when it first opened just less than 20 years ago, you notice it's swaying side to side. And what happens if you're walking and what you're walking on is swaying side to side? Well, you're going to start swaying side to side too. And so all the people notice are swaying together side to side. Guess what? They're amplifying, they're driving the bridge at its natural frequency. So it sets up this whole rhythmic motion that you can see the whole bridge is oscillating back and forth, which is amazing. A little bit scary. I don't know that I would want to be on that bridge. They later went back and added more support structures to counterbalance it. But this is incidentally why in the military, if you're marching across a bridge, the military is instructed to break step, because they don't want everyone marching in step and creating a driving frequency that could create resonance. You don't want to break the bridge. So resonance is something that we will also get to see a little bit when you take physics 3B and look at alternating current circuits with inductors and capacitors. That can also have resonance. And there it's a more desirable quality than when you're designing a building that you usually don't want to have huge amplitudes of oscillations. So there we have it. That is all of chapter 15 and all the material for physics 3A. We've made it to the end. If you're interested, there are some extra bonus problems at the end here. So there's 2 of them. I encourage you to check them out, get some extra practice as you're interested. But that brings us to the end. It's been quite an adventure. Thanks for joining me on this. Please feel free to ask questions. I'd love to talk further. about any and all of these ideas. Take care, y'all.